Spiritual revolution, the quest to experience God. And we sponsor one or two public talks a year, but this one has a special relationship to the town. Last week's Lexington Minuteman just came out last Thursday, had an ad for the lecture. Some of you may have seen it, but the front page has an article about titled Lexington Reviews Mental Health Demand and Services. And this is the town's efforts in what's recognized as an area that where a number of people seem in need of some help in that regard. But months ago, the faith communities in Lexington affiliated with the Lexington Interfaith Clergy Association, of which our church is a member, got together and made kind of a commitment to do something in their own way that would address this subject on the first weekend of May of this year. And Julia's talk this evening is our church's effort to be part of that, and she'll cover really kind of our overall framework of Christian healing and what we as Christian scientists approach things. But you'll see as she goes along that's part of what we're going to cover. And then maybe it's an expression of our solidarity with the other religious communities in Lexington and they with us. We asked the pastor of one of the churches in Lexington, Brent Maracle, who's the pastor of Christ Revolution Church, if he could finish this little two-part introduction by introducing Ms. Nisi to you. So, Brent, please.
Well, it really is a pleasure when I got the email from Susan asking me to introduce Julia Nisi and this talk on the spiritual revolution, experiencing, or I guess it's a quest to experiencing God. I thought I was honored. I'm part of the Lexington Interfaith Clergy Association. I'm the co-president and I pastor here. And I thought it was neat for us to come together to talk about mental health. In Christ Revolution Church, one of our aspects is a revolution to the mind, because the mind has a lot to do with our spiritual health as well. Because there's a wholeness, and a lot of times in Western culture, we tend to break apart and we don't quite put back together, right? So we believe in mental health is an aspect of our spiritual health as well at Christ Revolution Church. So, and as some of you probably are asking, why in the world is this Pentecostal pastor even here? Well, it's a part of our togetherness in the Interfaith Clergy Association to stand together in solidarity for a common good that's going to bring a greater quality of life here in Lexington, and that is mental health. And so it's just a deep honor for me. Julia Nisi began her career in psychotherapy, and then through that career found Christian Science and began bringing those two together. She eventually did leave psychotherapy practice and became a practitioner of Christian Science, and then later on a teacher, and then later on a lecturer, which actually came together about the same time. But she's one of 39 lecturers for Christian Science worldwide, and it's just a pleasure to have her here in Lexington. And would you give her a great round of applause and welcome?
Thank you both so much. That's just lovely. And this idea, this interfaith, I just am so touched by what's going on. This is an amazing town, I have to say. I'm not sure, I've lived in the Northeast my whole life, went to college at UNH in Durham, so I spent a lot of time in Boston. But I think this is my first time in Lexington. Yeah, surprising, isn't it? And if I was here, it was a long time ago. But it's a great community. I love what the Interfaith the Clergy Association is doing. I'm part of the Clergy Association in my town. I'm from Fairfield, Connecticut, and boy, we don't really, click along the way you all do. So it's inspiring to me. I'm going to take some of their lessons and bring it back to our association there. But thank you all. What a beautiful day, right? God's day. Oh my gosh. Just beautiful. After it's been a long winter, hasn't it?
Yeah.
It has been in Connecticut, and I think here too. It's been a tough one. So I'm really grateful. A day like this is just gorgeous. So, coming to Lexington, I was brushing up on my American history, and I understand from some of the folks that live here that there's a little bit of controversy, but Lextonians will say this is the birthplace of American liberty. Are we in agreement about that here?
Yes.
Yes, we're not going to share that with any other town or city. Let me just tell you a quick story, because when I thought about that, one of my students wrote to me recently, and he told me about the freedom he is now experiencing from being addicted to cigarettes. He was a smoker for 40 years, long time. He made many efforts to quit in those years, but never successfully. And he said it was always because in his mind, his motives weren't really good. He said he was doing it because it was expensive, it was inconvenient, it was becoming socially unacceptable. But he felt that, his motive, and there were times he said that he got so fed up, he threw his cigarettes out the window in a rainstorm, and then was so desperate, he dug them out of a gutter, dried them out in his oven, and then smoked them. So he was, in one sense, we would say this was very much holding him in bondage. But through experiencing the title of this revolution, the quest to experience God, through his deepening understanding and experiencing his relationship with his Creator, he today is completely free of that and has been for years. And it's just, he said, it's like he's been reborn. It's like a new birth for him to be free from this weight. And so you talk about freedom, you talk about liberty. He's certainly experiencing that. And we're going to talk tonight about this experience of God. And I have some examples of people, my own and others, that have had that experience of coming into a deeper communion with our Creator, with our Maker, with, as Christian Science designates God as Father, Mother God, and experiencing the freedom that goes with that. So right here in the birthplace of American liberty. And of course, the shock heard around the world. When I told my fiance I was coming here, he said, the shock that was heard around the world. It's the first thing that he thought of when he thought of this town. And the revolution that we're going to talk about, though, tonight, it's not a political revolution, it's not a social revolution, it's not even a grilling revolution. We went out to buy a grill, we're setting up our home, and I saw the sign like the grilling revolution. It's not a grilling revolution, it's a spiritual revolution. And Mary Baker Eddy, the woman who discovered and founded Christian Science, I'm going to guess that many of you are familiar or know something about her. She wrote, "We are in the midst of a revolution." She wrote that in the 1800s. But what she was talking about was this spiritual revolution. And it's one that doesn't belong just to the 1800s. That this is something that has continued and expanded right to today. And maybe some of you are familiar with Diana Butler Bass. She's a Christian theologian and author, a contemporary thought leader, really, in the arena of spirituality and health and healing. She wrote this in one of her recent books, that we are in the midst of a worldwide phenomenon, a profound global inquiry going on across cultures. That's huge. A profound global inquiry going on across cultures. Well, I said all of this to a friend recently about the spiritual revolution. He said to me, you better tell them what you mean by spiritual, and you better tell them what you mean by revolution. Because today, the term spirituality means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. If we put, 5 or 6 people in a room, you may very well get 5 or 6 different definitions of what spirituality means to them, or at least 3 or 4. Because I talk to people about their spiritual path all the time, and I'm finding that it means different things, and people define it and describe it in different ways. So for our purposes, when I'm talking about spirituality, I'm talking about what I understand to be the biblical use of that concept, that God is spirit. So when I talk about our spirituality, I'm talking about that which evolves from, animated by our relationship with God, with spirit. And really, the essence of who and what we are is spiritual. And there's a wonderful little Bible passage from Jeremiah where it says, I will give them a heart to know me, that I am the Lord. And they will be my people and I will be their God. So you see, this spirituality, it's the essence of who we are, and we have a heart to know God. It's impelling to that's what I think is impelling and propelling this quest to experience deity. Because we have a heart, that's what beats in every single one of us. A heart to know our Creator. And St. Augustine wrote a favorite passage of mine. He said, our hearts are restless until they rest in you, O Lord. Our hearts are restless until they rest in you. Well, doesn't that make sense? It's kind of logical. If we have a heart to know God, we're going to be restless until we rest in that understanding and in that relationship, in that communion with our God. So the spiritual revolution, well, I've been a part of it. You heard in the introduction, I started my professional career as a psychotherapist. And at that time, I started rebelling against what I would call my childhood God. The imagery of God that I had been taught as a child, that God is love and cares and loves us, but also that God can punish us, that sends disease and wars and storms. So in other words, I was just having trouble, this idea that God had a two-sided nature, that there was I was just rebelling and revolting against that. And you know, I think that there are folks today, as I have traveled around and talked with them, that idea of God, that imagery, that there is a revolution going on against that view of God's two-sided nature. We're going to talk about Christian Science, the healing system without the use of drugs or surgery it's used for healing, it's based on Jesus' life, it's used for spiritual growth, but it teaches that God has a single-sided nature, that God is good and only good, not a two-sided nature. And part of the revolution was that I didn't want to know anything more about God. I wanted a real, practical, tangible relationship with the Supreme Being, with the Almighty, that no matter what I was dealing with in my life, that I knew that there was a place I could go for help, that there was a reliable, safe, constant power, influence that I could turn to that would be, as the Bible says, a present help in trouble. And no matter what it was I was dealing with, whether it was a health issue, a relationship issue, whether it was a concern about work, a financial concern, but that there was a yearning in me for something more than what the physical senses can give us. And I find that today, as I talk to people, there is and I've done research, I've read different studies and surveys that have been done, and that there is, individuals want a direct experience with the sacred. They want a direct experience with the sacred. No more about, I want to know that this is real, relevant, practical, tangible in my life. So I would say, what is the spiritual revolution? Well, I would define it and say it's a rebellion against the limits of what the physical senses can give us and do for us. And it's a seeking after a more perfect, a seeking after a grander, higher understanding of what God is and how to make God practical in our lives. Now, not everybody's going to describe it that way. People use, as I said in the beginning in defining spirituality, there's different ways that people talk about this, but I think that heart to know God that beats in all of us, that is restless, that's that's what folks are seeking after, and that's what this revolution is about. Dr. David Hufford is someone that I got to know some years ago. I had the privilege of being on the faculty at Harvard Medical School's continuing education symposium on spirituality and healing in medicine. And Dr. Hufford and I did a workshop together for a number of them. And he is now retired, but he was recognized as an expert in this field of spirituality and health and healing. He was at Penn State. And he said to me one time that we are right now in the midst of quite possibly the greatest spiritual awakening. And he said, certainly of modern times. We are in the midst of a spiritual revolution. I've heard it described this way as well, that individuals are yearning to fill the God-shaped hole. Has anyone ever heard that expression? The God-shaped hole? H-O-L-E. I've had people say to me, are you saying W-H-O-L-E or H-O-L-E? I said H-O-L-E. You know, this past year I've had the opportunity to lecture in prisons in different parts of the country, and they've just been absolutely amazing experiences. Amazing experiences. So I shared this idea with this group of men that I was speaking with, and I told them this God-shaped hole. If they hadn't heard of it, I said, well, do you have any idea what it is? And one of the inmates, as fast as lightning, said, that place in all of us that only God can fill. And I was like, yeah, you said it better than I could. That place in us that only God can fill. Well, what filled it for me, and what we're going to drill down on here tonight, is Christian Science. Christian Science, this healing system based on Jesus' life and teachings. And it's actually a way of understanding existence, very being, our very being. It really gives us a new model or a new paradigm for understanding what's good and pure and enduring and permanent in our lives, based right on Jesus' life and ministry. And these teachings transcend denomination. They transcend geographical borders and can be used by anyone, anywhere, anytime for healing and for spiritual growth. And I have surely found in the 20 plus years, 25, however many years it's been now, that it is a safe and effective way to care for ourselves and to experience the all-power, the all-presence of God as infinite, as the Bible tells us, as love, as infinite, inexhaustible, divine love, and as our common Father, Mother, God, that each and every one of us has, this our Creator, our Father, Mother, God. And it gives us a revolutionary perspective on our identity in that relationship with our Creator and what it means to be the child of God. It's radical. It's absolutely radical, the view of understanding who we are as the children of God. And it explains that spiritual and expounds on the spiritual likeness we each have with our Creator, that defining us in that way. And it teaches us how to make that relationship tangible and practical in our lives, day in and day out, day in and day out. And to come to see that what we have comes right from our one infinite source, God, the qualities, our abilities, our faculties come right from God to us. And you know, Mary Baker Eddy, the woman, as I said, that discovered and founded this healing system, she wrote in her book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, which explains Christian Science. It's a transforming book. You start engaging with those ideas and things will never be the same, and I'll just tell you in a moment about my journey with that. But she writes in there that Christian Science meets a yearning of the human race for spirituality. Christian Science meets a yearning, that's a pretty bold statement, meets a yearning of the human race for spirituality. I mean, think about that within your own life. I mean, who, or someone that you know, who hasn't sought after or sought for, desired for just a deeper sense of peace within themselves, right? Or how about just a more secure sense for one's health and well-being? Or better, more harmonious relationships? I mean, these are the kinds of things many of us seek after and yearn after. And what Christian Science shows us that it's possible that as we come to understand and deepen our conviction about that relationship we each have with our Creator, as the child of God, as the child of this one infinite source, Father, Mother, God, that these yearnings in us are met in increasingly more permanent ways, more satisfying ways, more reliable ways. And so I can tell you from experience that these ideas, Christian Science teachings, do not leave you where it found you, where they found you. As mentioned, you know, I was a clinician. I had a straight up psychotherapy practice. I had a license as a marriage and family therapist. I worked in the addiction field. I had a private practice. I worked with adults. I worked with children. I mean, it was a lot of years in a very broad type of practice that I had a variety of settings. But as I started reading Science and Health, I had this yearning in me, my heart was restless, but as I started reading that book, I had the most incredible experience of having this feeling of having come home. I was a spiritual seeker, and I still am. And that, when I started reading that book, I felt I had come home. I had felt like shared this sacred space with the author. Like she understood me. What she was writing about, it's like, this is what I've always known, what I felt in my heart of hearts, but never had the conceptualization to articulate it or to understand it in this way. And so what ended up happening, you know, for me, is that the more that I was seeing myself from this perspective, see, I had been taught as a therapist, and just a little disclaimer first, as a therapist, I mean, I have a lot of friends that are still in the psychotherapy field. Mental health professionals do a lot of wonderful, wonderful work. So I'm just talking to you about my lessons and my journey where God took me. So just to be clear about that. But for me, as I studied this more, as I was learning and experiencing it more in my day-to-day life, I found that this view of God that Mary Baker Eddy gives in her book and throughout her other writings, in the key to the scriptures, the Bible was opening up to me. I had the Bible my entire life. It was opening up to me in new and fresh and practical ways. This idea, for Eddy, it was years of devotion, of consecration, of prayer, and inspiration from God, as well as research that she did and experiments that she did and seeking after healing for herself and treating patients, that she came to this understanding of God and our relationship and who we are. What was so radical for me was what Christian Science taught me, was showing me about who I am and then how I think about who I am. And what started to shift was I was moving away from, and this is hardly, I'm a work in progress, it's hardly done, but moving away from thinking of myself from like the material kind of viewpoint of, you know, being a certain age, having, you know, how often during the course of a day or a week are we asked, how old are you, when's your birthday, right? Or just a particular, you know, physical appearance, education level, heritage in terms of, you know, your genetic, your parents, you know, and whether you had a happy home life. Just gradually letting go step by step from that view and embracing a sense of understanding myself in my likeness to my Creator, and thinking of myself in terms of spiritual qualities, as a tapestry, a mosaic of spiritual qualities like goodness, kindness, resilience, persistence, spiritual strength, moral courage, joy, all of that. And so the more I did that, and I started to experience healings in my life, the more I realized this is not just about me. This is not true just for me. This is for everyone. This is a universal truth that's for everyone. And I so wanted to share it with others. And what I did was I started kind of sneaking some of the ideas into my psychotherapy practice and sharing them with people and giving out science and health occasionally to folks who had a Bible and then we get into a conversation. But I felt in order to be true to myself, in order to be true to the folks that were coming to me for help and how I can be most helpful, one day I made a decision after years of prayer, study, growth, struggle at times. At times I felt like I just didn't know which end was up. I decided to leave my mental health practice and have a practice as a Christian Science practitioner. People often ask me, what's the main difference? What's the main difference in how you practice then and how you practice now? And I have to say, the answer to that question for me is based on what I'm describing to you in terms of how we understand who we are. If you think, when I was a therapist and I look at these TV commercials, when we've got some kind of a malady, whether it's a mental health issue, whether it's a physical issue, it's like, this is mine. It's a part of who I am. My depression, my anxiety, right? My X, my Y, right? It's a part of who you are. And you do your best to either manage it, deal with it, hopefully overcome it. But with Christian Science, remember this is about freedom. Like my dear student who was set free from the smoking, it's about freedom. It says, no, that's not how God made you. That's not how God knows you. And you have the right to be free of that, to be completely free of that. It is no part of who you are as the child of God. And you have the right to be free. And so for me, what happened was, as I said, I left the field and I started my practice. One day it was mental health, the next day, literally it was just one day separated. I felt a little bit like Nora, this little girl who wrote to God, "Dear God, I don't ever feel alone since I found out about you. I don't ever feel alone since I found out about you." And I felt this increasing sense of freedom. Now let me just tell you how this can be, for me, the way it evolved in my life was in terms of my career, and then of course I've had many healings over decades. But I want to tell you about an inmate and just how powerful the mental shift and what happens in terms of within us, the transformation that's possible, and how quickly it can happen. Of an inmate. Now this was a friend of mine. I've been doing these lectures in prisons, and a friend of mine was doing the same thing. So this happened to him. He gave a talk. It was at a men's prison. And after the talk was over, Marcus, as I understand it, a very large man came over to my friend, who's an average sized guy, and he said, these are his words. He said, "Man, you really messed me up. You were talking about what it means to be the child of God, that's who I really am." And then he went on to tell him that before the talk, he had been having this run-in with one of the other inmates. And it had been going on and on. And Marcus, before going to the talk, had decided when it was over, he was going to take care of it once and for all, and he was going to go kill this other inmate. That he had resolved that this was going to be the end of it. He was going to kill him. But he said something made him come to this, quote, stupid talk. So that's what he said. But he went to the talk because he had a heart to know God. There's that yearning in him, right, that was touched in him. And he went to this talk. And he said, "I came to hear this stupid talk. Now I have to go back to my cell and think of myself as a child of God and what that means. And I have to think about him that way too, don't I?" And my friend said, "Yes, you do." And Marcus had tears. Picture this, an inmate that had planned to kill someone. Tears streaming down his face. Hugged my friend, gave him a big hug, and he said to him, "Thanks for messing me up." Powerful, powerful. There's a wonderful little Bible passage from Romans. Don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mold, but let God remake you so that your whole attitude of mind is changed. Thus you will prove in practice that the will of God is good, acceptable to Him, and perfect. Don't let the world squeeze you into its mold. How often do we do that? We accept the things that we are told, right, and we let that define us. What Marcus did, what I've been doing, I'll tell you some other healings where it's like, no, I'm going to let God remake me how I think about myself, how I live, right? Until my whole attitude of mind, and that's what happened for me, it happened for Marcus, and it happened for Laverne and Shiloh. Laverne and Shiloh. Laverne came into my life to take care of my mother. She needed nursing care. And so Laverne came every day to take care of my mom. And she had she had a yearning to have the God-shaped hole filled. And so we got into many conversations about God, about Christian Science, and she was just like a sponge soaking up all of this. She too was in a sense of revolting. The childhood God she had been taught was just not working for her. She needed something different, something new, something more practical for her. And we talked about this Bible passage, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you from Psalms, which I was referencing a little earlier. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Right? Our refuge and strength. And she loved that idea. She absolutely loved that idea. We talked about that idea of God as good and only good. God's nature being just pure goodness. And so she came to a lecture like this. I invited her and she loved it and she listened and she absorbed. And then shortly after that, something interesting happened. Her young 7-year-old daughter, Shyla, started to experience some abdominal pain and wasn't able to eat. And so Laverne, as a good mother, took her to the physician. And he took x-rays and then called her and said that Shyla had gallstones. And that from his perspective, for a child of 7 years old to have gallstones was unusual. And he told her to bring her back in a few days and that they were going to do some kind of a treatment, and if that didn't work, Shyla would have to have surgery. So Laverne became very, very frightened. She called me up and she said, would you please come over because this is what's happened and maybe there's something, can you come over and talk with us, pray, whatever, just come over, please. So I went to her house and sat down with Shia and I spent time with Shyla. I learned that Shyla was having a hard time in school. She was new and she wasn't fitting in with this new school. She was having a hard time learning. She just it wasn't really working for her. And so what we did, we talked, we read the Bible, we read Science and Health, and we prayed. Now, there are lots of different ways to pray. I've heard it said that we all pray to God in our own language, and there isn't a language that God doesn't understand. Right? There isn't a language that God doesn't understand. Actually, anyone here a grandparent or have grandchildren? No, yes? Some? Well, this grandfather was walking through his yard and he heard his granddaughter repeating the alphabet. And it was in a tone of voice that sounded like a prayer. And he asked her, what are you doing? And she said, I'm praying, but I can't think of exactly the right words, so I'm just saying all the letters, and God will put them together for me because He knows what I'm thinking. Little children, right? Out of the mouth of babes, a little child shall lead them, right? So, there are many different ways to pray. And for me, and when I was with Laverne, for me, prayer is not so much reciting, certain words, or even a pleading or a petitioning of God for something, but often it's a quiet listening. I'm learning as I grow and listen, because God is communicating to us all the time, and just listening for those messages from our Father, Mother, God. And it's also, as I understand it, a deep spiritual reasoning in terms of thinking out from these ideas that I'm sharing with you what I understand to be true about God and our relationship with Him, with her. And it helps lift us up to have a more spiritual view of things. Not that our prayer is changing God, it's changing us. And so in this case, with Laverne, she was so fearful. And you know, sometimes fear can be absolutely paralyzing. You know, I don't know if anyone's ever felt that when you haven't felt well, that you just feel like you're immobilized, right? Just absolutely immobilized. And so I thought that the most important thing was to address that fear with her. And so what I did was I was just affirming out loud God's inexhaustible love, that love was a present help in trouble, no matter what the diagnosis had been, no matter what the doctors said, that divine love was a powerful presence that we could rely on and that would heal her daughter. And so, you know, we talked and we prayed for a bit on that because, you know, with fear, it's always like a supposition. It's a lot of what ifs. I mean, if you peel away the layers with fear, it's what if God really isn't real? What if I'm not worthy to be healed? What if? We went with the what is. So rather than the what if, we say what is, that God is this infinite, inexhaustible love, a present help in trouble. And so we looked at one of the ways that Eddie talks about God in and defines God in Science and Health is this. She writes that the Christian Science God is universal, eternal, divine love, which changeth not and causeth no evil, disease, nor death. Causes no evil, disease, nor death. And we thought about that. I mean, that was just for her, it meant so much, that idea that God doesn't cause this illness. And so that if God, love, is not causing it, it doesn't have the kind of power that it would claim to. And that we are able to challenge that. And we also thought about, you know, the first chapter of Genesis says that we are made in God's very image and God's very likeness. So we thought about this idea of being the image of love, right? Not that bundle of material elements, but rather the very image of kindness, of gentleness, of sweetness, of goodness. That's who and what we really are, compassion. And so what we call the physical senses, or what we call materiality, what they really are is just, it's a distorted sense, a mistaken sense, if you will, of our godlikeness, which is present right here and right now. It's like a dense fog. It's like a dense fog. You know, earlier this year, I was out in Portland, Oregon. It was my first trip out there, and I spent 3 days there. Has anyone ever been there and seen the mountains? Yes, and seen the mountains. I didn't see the mountains because I was there for 3 days, but you didn't see them. People, I understand, the folks in Portland said that the way we talk about our mountains is that they're either out or they're not out. Well, I was there for 3 days and they were not out for 3 days, but I knew they were there. I knew they were there. And that's what that material kind of distorted sense of things is, that our godlikeness, being the image of our Creator, is there, but this other is a distorted, mistaken sense. And so prayer helps us to align more and more fully with this view. So by the time I left, I assured Shyla too that no matter what, she was lovable. And to feel that love of God was as natural as breathing. It was as natural as breathing. And so by the time I left, for Laverne, the fear was beginning to dissolve, and in its place, hope, a sense of expectation of good, was emerging right there where the fear had been. And for Shyla, she was beginning to feel a greater sense, just you know, the smile came to her face, some of the unhappiness was beginning to dissolve right there. So Laverne, I agreed, she asked me, I continued praying, and of course studying the Bible, studying Science and Health, they were doing both as well. And pretty quickly there was noticeable improvement in Shyla's condition. And she began to be able to, the pain was subsiding, she was beginning to be able to eat. And then, very dutifully, as she was instructed, Laverne took her back to the physician, who took another set of x-rays. And he took the set of x-rays, and guess what he found? Nothing. Nothing. He said to her, is this the same child that was here last week? The gallstones are gone. They're gone. We had experienced God. It was an experience. It was a God moment. It was a God moment. And it was really a sacred time for all of us to see and feel that light within just emerge and say, this child is well. That's how God knows her, that's how God makes her, that's how God keeps her, sustains her. Because in Christian Science, where it's not ultimately about fixing a material condition that's gone wrong. That's really not what it's about. That's not dealing with the surface symptoms. It's going deeper. It's this need to experience our connection with our God, to experience that. And that's what happened here. And people today, I hear it all the time from patients, from friends, from acquaintances, that they want to feel connected, a deep sense of connection and belonging. And that's what happened. And I often see Shyla today, and she's grown into a beautiful young woman, no recurrence of the issues, as I understand that. And so really, Christian Science is not about treating that material condition, it's really this awakening. It's an awakening to the presence and power of God right here. So a few words about what Christian Science is not. So Christian Science is not Scientology, in case anyone thought that. I often get that, when I tell people Christian Science, the first thing I say, it's not Scientology. It's often confused. It's not blind faith healing. So it's not just claiming God's healing power, but without any sense that there are spiritual principles that undergird, spiritual laws that are in operation, undergirding the healing work. It's not mind over matter. It's not just like using willpower to overcome a physical problem. And it's not just positive thinking, where thinking good thoughts alone are enough. And it's also not just for members of the Christian Science denomination. It's universal. These are universal spiritual truths that can be used by anyone, anywhere, anytime. It is the science of Christ, a way of understanding what Jesus' life, Jesus' teachings showed us about God, showed us about life, showed us about reality itself. And it's a safe and effective way to care for one's health without the use of drugs or surgery. Now, as I mentioned, Eddie wrote in her book that Christian Science meets a yearning of the human race for spirituality. Well, as I said, that's a pretty bold statement for her to make. And how could she do that? Well, she herself was seeking after, she was part of a spiritual revolution. In many ways, she was revolting against some of the aspects of her childhood God, a God that was punitive, a God with a two-sided nature, and she was seeking after a more reliable sense of health. She was looking to understand God more fully. She was asking the same questions about prayer, about identity, about purpose, about meaning. And she was truly an original thinker. And she was not content with traditional thinking. She didn't just accept the surface of things, and she dug deeper. She went deeper. And she always felt something compelling her in a spiritual direction throughout her life. And she loved Jesus. She loved Jesus. She had a heart deeply rooted in her Christian faith. Deeply, deeply rooted. And she went on to become a very prominent world figure. Her life was huge. She had a remarkable life. She was a remarkable woman. And she had the spirit of a real scientific investigator. And she was asking herself these questions. She said, again and again I asked myself, what was the method by which Jesus helped the sick and the sinful? What was the method by which Jesus healed? And then she said she was assiduously pondering the solution to this great question. Is it matter or is it mind that heals the sick? And when she uses mind there, she's using a capital M to designate God. It's as that one source of all right thinking and acting, the universal all good spiritual consciousness, divine mind. She was trying to figure this out. And then after years of spiritual growth, of prayer, of study, of revelation, of scientific investigation, of experiments, of treating patients, being treated herself, she experienced a moment of just vivid spiritual clarity and illumination when she was faced with what some believed to be fatal injury. And she experienced that moment of clarity and illumination that she was so sharp that she began to get well right there and ultimately was completely healed of those injuries. And she had been quite ill during the first half of her life. But this was a real transformative moment, and she does identify it as her time when she discovered Christian Science, as her discovery. And she saw that, she came to see that undergirding Jesus's practice, his healing practice, that there were spiritual laws and principles that were in full operation. They were natural. They could be discerned, they could be understood, they could be taught, they could be applied for healing. We saw it with Shiloh, that idea that God doesn't cause illness, that love never does that. That was a spiritual principle, that Shiloh was healed upon that. And that she also saw, Eddie realized that God was beyond any sense of a material view. And she thought, saw God as a principle, capital P, a divine principle that existed and functioned and was ever active. And so you can think of her, she had, this was a journey for Eddie. This didn't all happen all at once. She had an initial enlightenment. You can think of it as, has anyone heard of the mind-body connection? Yeah, that's her initial enlightenment was like the mind-body connection, the human mind, and the influence it has on our health and well-being. But Eddie went further. Remember, she wasn't content with just the surface of things. She went further, and she ultimately came to see and understand that divine mind, capital M, God, was the only healer. That divine mind, God, alone was the healer. And she realized that that mind or God, that pure, perfect, Christly consciousness, that was essential to Jesus' ability to heal the sick and the sinning. And it's essential to anyone's ability to heal. And that Christly consciousness is a spiritual mentality that's connected to God. It's a godlike way of thinking that leads to a godlike way of living. And it's based in a spiritual sense of things rather than a material one. Now Jesus, God loved Jesus more than anyone else, understood this and lived this, embodied this so fully that he was given the title Christ Jesus. Christ Jesus. Eddie realized that the divinity of Jesus' nature, this divine way of thinking and being, was possible for anyone, for everyone and anyone. And she said, and it was this divine mind as the one source of all true thinking, inspiration, and understanding for anyone. And you can say, well, how did she know that? She proved it. Eddie had a healing record that was astounding. She healed, just to give you some idea, she healed others of cancer, paralysis, blindness, pneumonia, heart disease, physical deformity, and so much more. Those are just some of what she did it over decades. And she quickly realized that this could be taught, it could be understood. This healing system, these healing principles could be taught and understood by anyone. And after she discovered this was in 1866. In 1875, 9 years later, she published the first edition of her book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. And she described it as my manual of the practice of Christian Science mind healing. My manual of the practice. And really, that publication in 1875 set the stage for all that was to come in coming decades. And, you know, these ideas, as I said, they certainly don't leave us where it found us. And they meet us. The beauty to Christian Science, you may be just beginning to study Christian Science, maybe you don't know much about it, or maybe you're a long-time student and you've been studying and practicing it, but it's like math. You know, it's like you start at the very beginning, and as your understanding grows and expands, you know, you continue to advance. And my friend Don was someone that started very early on. He just had kind of this, I met him at the gym, of all places. I met him at the local gym, and what happened was we started having these impromptu discussions after our workouts. And this little group of us were having these spiritual conversations, and I was sharing about Christian Science. And he gradually kind of found his way into our group. He had always been a spiritual seeker, and his girlfriend, who later became his wife, was part of it. And so when they got married, they asked me to do readings from the Bible and Science and Health at their wedding. And so I did, and was happy to do that. It was so interesting because when the wedding was over, he said to me, he said, those readings meant so much to me. They were so spiritual. They transcended denomination. They were so spiritual. And I looked at him, I'm like, you're getting ready to get married? You actually were listening to my readings. I didn't think that anyone listened to the readings at weddings. It was really pretty, I was surprised, but it touched him and it actually set him on a path. And there are a couple of things that I told him I was going to share this story, and he said he has experienced God, and it's helped him overcome long-standing resentments in his family towards his parents and his brother, who he felt got treated better than he. It's helped him overcome this fear of death that just plagued him his entire life. Financial insecurities have been healed because he said he's come to understand a different view of life, a different way of thinking about himself and his relationship with God, that it set him, remember, freedom from all of these things that have plagued him for his life. And he said to me, you know, as I reflect on my footsteps in the world of spirit, he said, I believe I've always been a Christian Scientist. I've just realized it through this journey. And he just realized it through this journey. But he was healed of all of these. So you think, my heart was this yearning in me for something more, this revolting was healed, was met. Marcus, he had this transformative, powerful experience. Laverne and Shyla and now Dawn, these ideas, they're transformative. This idea of this Christly light within each and every one of us, it changes things. It transforms, it heals, it uplifts, it redeems, it restores, it regenerates us. And Eddie, you know, I mentioned earlier that she had this transformative moment that she identifies as her discovery. There's another way she talks about that. She said, this watershed moment, this is what she said. She said, that short experience included a glimpse of the great fact that I have since tried to make plain to others, namely life in and of spirit. This life being the sole reality of existence. Life in and of spirit being that is a game changer. That is a whole different paradigm for understanding existence. Because think about it, soul means only, right? It means the one and only. She's saying our spiritual life in God, in good, is the only reality of existence, that there aren't two, a material and a spiritual. There aren't two minds, a human and a divine. There's just one, singular, one creator, one creation, spiritual, here and now. What's around us is a distortion, a misunderstanding, a misperception, a limited perception, like those mountains that were there, but I couldn't see them through the fog. And Jesus put it this way. He said, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom of heaven is within you. Thy kingdom come, in the Lord's Prayer, right? Jesus was saying that kingdom of heaven is not a far remote place, a distant place that we've got to die to get to, but it's a present reality here and now. It's a spiritual consciousness of the presence and power of God within each and every one of us, attainable for each and every one of us, increasingly as we come to know and understand ourselves in the way we've been talking as the child of God, as the God-likeness, as the image and likeness of our Creator. Because Jesus, we know, he just went right past that material view, right to a spiritual place in each and every one. We are spiritual beings having a spiritual experience. Spiritual beings having a spiritual experience. And I'm going to just give you one more example. And I know we've been talking about mental health, and this is someone that started to experience a severe depression in middle school. So he was a young man. In high school, it was so severe, he attempted suicide. He attempted to take his life, and gratefully he was not successful. But he said, even though he had been raised actually in a Christian Science family and attended Sunday school, he said he had a deep conviction, all right, but the deep conviction was that God did not exist. That God did not exist. And he said, these are his words, he said, everything I thought the power of the universe was trying to crush me out totally. Trying to utterly crush me out. At the same time, there was this in him something, this spiritual sense, this little bit pushing him forward. And he, on some level, he knew that his help, the only place he was going to be helped was if he turned to his God. So what he did was he was studying the Bible. He, over the course of a few years, he read through Science and Health, cover to cover, over a dozen times. More than a dozen times. He said he lost count. And he said with every page, he said there was this, these are his words again, this irresistible sense of hope on every page. An irresistible sense of hope. And there's a place in Science and Health where Mary Baker Eddy talks about the great verities of spirit. She talks about the all power, all presence, all science of God, filling all space. God, all powerful, constituting all science. And that contradicts forever the belief that matter is actual. So this idea of life, he was just holding on to this idea of life in and of spirit. It was becoming more and more meaningful to him. And he said one night, when it was in the dark, he had been reading, praying, studying, he said it was like he had been held underwater for all of this time, and suddenly, unexpectedly, it was like he was released from being underwater. And he said it was a defining moment. He said the depression didn't completely leave him at that moment, but it was a defining moment, and he began, and eventually was completely healed of this. And he said God had become, remember he had a conviction God didn't exist. The shift that went on is that God became, quote, stunningly real to me. Went from unreal to real. Completely healed of a crippling depression. And he said it brought me back to a sense of life. Again, you can think of life with a capital L, a sense of God. And it put his life right on track. He said he had experienced through this time pinpricks of light. And if we think of that Christ, of the Christliness, or the Christ in each and every one of us, pinpricks of light, that's what he was experiencing through this time. And he said here's what he said about Christian Science. It raised me up above the drowning wave and set me on a course of usefulness and spiritual discovery. Who he really is, what God is, how to make that practical. It healed me of the crippling depression and gave me a reason to live. And listen to this, I love this. He said, I have learned that when the need is great, the answer in Christian Science is always greater. Because the answer is experiencing God. And so that depression, that those gallstones, the hatred, that's like bad data. It's like bad data. That's really what it is. And Christian Science helps us by pouring in these truths of who and what we are as the children of God and what's possible and how loved we are and how God is loving and caring for us and what is really positive in our life. We can experience, as each of the folks I've described to you here tonight have, increasingly sense of freedom. The freedom that Christian Science, the liberty that's rightfully ours. It's ours here and now, and it's possible. We can achieve it step by step as we deepen our understanding, as we deepen our conviction of what it means to be the child of God and learn more about our Creator. And to understand that experience, the availability of divine love, that we can never get outside the orbit of infinite love. No matter where we are, no matter what it is that's going on, we are embraced forever, cared for in that love, in those arms of our God. So Christian Science gives us an opportunity to have these moments of experiences of the kingdom of heaven at hand, get glimpses of it. I've had it, others have had it, of that spiritual mentality, that consciousness that's aligned with God more and more fully, to experience that day in and day out, moment by moment, thought by thought. There's a Bible passage, bringing every thought to the obedience of Christ, thinking what God is giving us to think, to know. You know, it helps us, Christian Science helps us to discover who we really are in spirit, life in and of spirit, and to demonstrate and prove that in our lives more and more fully. And you know, Mary Baker Eddy had the deepest love, appreciation, and respect for each and every one of us in our spiritual path and journey with our God. She dedicates her book to honest seekers for truth. And she said, the time for thinkers has come. Well, I know each and every one of you here tonight is a thinker, and your time has come. And I want to just end with a challenge, an invitation, an affirmation that Mary Baker Eddy gives us in her book. And she writes this. She says, you can prove for yourself, dear reader, the science of healing. She's telling us we can prove it. She's saying, don't take my word for it. Don't take her word for it. You can prove it for yourself, dear reader. Now, to do that, you're going to need this book along with the Bible to study, to pray. Remember, it's the key to the scriptures that helps to open up the Bible to you. If you don't have a copy, the church has very graciously made copies available on the back table. But she tells us you can prove for yourself, dear reader. So I would encourage everyone here, take up the author's challenge and prove it for yourself, because we are in the midst of a spiritual revolution. And I thank you all for your attention tonight. I'm happy to stay and take questions individually if you want to come up. I'm happy to chat with anyone. I know we've gone our hour, so I don't want to keep anyone if you need to go, but I'm happy to chat individually.